The New York Knicks continue their series with the Indiana Pacers on Friday night when they play Game 3 in Naptown. Knicks lead the series 2-0, but there are some injury concerns surrounding the Knickerbockers. So let's talk some Knicks playoff hoops and preview Game 3. We're going to do that with the Dean of Knicks Film School, Jonathan Macri, who joins me now. J-Mac, what's going on? We're going to talk about some complaints here. I'm just wondering, has anybody ever filed a complaint against KFS? Has that happened to you?
I'm pretty sure there's a whole drawer in Andrew Claudio's office filled with those. Thankfully, he insulates me from any of that stuff. So, that's why they pay him the big bucks.
Shout out to executive producer extraordinaire Andrew Claudio. I got to ask Andrew next time I see him if he has more than 78 complaints. So we're going to start with that, about these complaints. Yeah. We'll start with that. After Game 2 on Wednesday, Pacers coach Rick Carlisle, he ripped the officiating, and the Pacers then filed a formal complaint against the NBA, citing, as I mentioned before, 78 different plays where they believe a call was made incorrectly in Games 1 and Game 2. What have you made of the officiating in this series, and do the Pacers have a legitimate beef here?
I mean, look, I understand why this came out after Game 2. Obviously, his team's down 2-0. He's frustrated. But I also thought the timing was strange in that there was an egregious call in this series, and it was the ball that was called a kickball, and obviously it was not a kickball, and it was unreviewable in Game 1, and that immediately preceded the Dante DiVincenzo 3 that was the difference in the game. I mean, that's a tough one. That's a tough break if you're a Pacers fan, if you're obviously someone that plays for the Pacers or coaches in the Pacers. And I gave them a lot of credit because I thought they took the high road after that. And you could cite the Turner illegal screen that was called in a spot that usually isn't called. But overall, I can't look at the way this series has been officiated and say that I have seen anything, forget about egregious, like that far outside the ordinary. And if there has been anything outside the ordinary, I can't even sit here and tell you, and I consider myself fairly unbiased, which side it favors more. The only other thing I'll say is, to me, it's not about the fact that they sent all these things into the league office, which every team does that, I think, after every game. Tom Thibodeau has spoken openly about how after games he sends his package of clips into the league office and usually gets told to, go on his merry way. But the fact that they made such a public deal out of it is a very clear attempt on the Pacers' part to, put this into the discourse, put some, pressure on the refs to give them a more favorable whistle moving forward.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this is somewhat of gamesmanship, if you want to call it that, looking as we move towards Game 3, right? There's could be at least a bit of that going on there. So something to keep your eye on when you watch how the game is called in Naptown. Okay, J-Mac, Knicks, they get a big win in Game 2 with Jalen Brunson's return. But the Knicks guard is listed as questionable for Game 3 with a sore right foot. We know the point guard has carried the Knicks offensively throughout the postseason. There's been some talk about what the Knicks should do here. Should Brunson play, or should he rest in Game 3?
I think it's a really interesting discussion because it doesn't come down to any one thing. Like, we could sit here and be like, well, if there's a risk of re-injury, and that risk of re-injury is, 20% or 30% or 40%, whatever number you want to attribute it to it, if he plays versus if he sits. But it's not that simple because, I think you could look at it from a different perspective and say, okay, whatever the risk of re-injury is after, if he plays in Game 3, the odds are that risk of re-injury will go down if he sits, and with each subsequent game that he sits out. And while I think some of this is going to come down to a pain tolerance thing, the fact that he could potentially limit himself more for the series moving forward is definitely a scary thought. Now, all that being said, we know who we're talking about here. This is Jalen Brunson. He's going to want to be out there. If he can move, he's going to be out there. So I wonder, I guess what I'm wondering is, whose decision is this going to come down to? Is this going to be something where they seek his input and ultimately the team feels comfortable going over his head if he says, yeah, I could tough it out, and they say, no, we don't think it's worth it. At the end of the day, you got to win 2 more games. And I know we're going to talk about OG Anunoby next, but I'm not sure that, there's going to be any, better or worse opportunities to get those next 2 wins than in any of these games. But we'll cross that bridge, I guess, next.
Right, and that's the thing, because there's the OG Anunoby factor, as you mentioned this too, because OG suffered a left hamstring injury in Game 2. He is listed as out for Game 3. And look, Anunoby, he was having his best game of his short Knicks career in Game 2 with 28 points. How do you think the Knicks should attempt to replace his production in the lineup for Game 3? Who takes his minutes in the rotation here?
Yeah, I mean, first let me just say, like, the fact that they've already, well, they haven't ruled him out, but we got a report from Adrian Wojnarowski that he is probably not going to go in Game 4. Lets me know that the Knicks have to be thinking about this as a long-term thing, and I don't mean long-term necessarily the rest of the postseason, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were preparing the rest of the series as if they are not going to see OG Anunoby at all. And I think that's important because I think they have, I don't know if leeway is the right word, but they are going to be able, I think they're going to have the time, I'll say that, to try some different things out. The first way that I would go would be Precious Achiuwa. And I think Precious has earned that right based on his play during the year. I thought he represented himself very well in the last 8 minutes of Game 2. I thought he was a part of the reason why they won that game. And the biggest thing for me is, based on how Indiana has defended in this series, I don't think if you're the Knicks, you should have any doubts that you're going to be able to score against this team. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, next. The problem is the defense, and you're scoring 132 points per 100 possessions, but you're also giving up 125. So, and Deuce McBride, look, Deuce is a good defender, but he is limited in terms of size. And I think the fact that the pressure the Pacers put on you, and the fact that they induce so many switches, to have one small defender out there in Jalen Brunson, that's enough to have to try to game plan around to make sure he doesn't get switched onto a Miles Turner or a Pascal Siakam. When you introduce a second small guard into that ecosystem, to say nothing of like Dante DiVincenzo, who isn't all that big himself, I think it just puts a little bit too much pressure on your defense. I think you go with Precious as the first option, see how that goes, and if if it's really not working out, you could always pivot to Deuce getting the majority of those minutes, and you just run essentially a 4-guard lineup out there and see how that works out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Tom Thibodeau chooses to do here in Game 3 and possibly beyond without OG Anunoby. Now, with all the injuries that the Knicks have had, the depth is really being tested here, yeah. J-Mac. Should Alec Burks or Jericho Sims see some playing time in Game 3?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at before, is referencing, again, the Knicks are scoring 132 points per 100 possessions. Now, the fact that they are doing that against the Pacers through these two games does not necessarily mean that they will continue to do that without OG Anunoby. Their lives will get more difficult on offense, certainly to score. But I think when you look at the issues that they've had defensively, and specifically the issues that they have had locking in, switching when they need to switch, switching on, like, making the correct switches, and then do or switch back if maybe they had to switch an initial matchup, but that's not a good matchup. Like, there's a lot going on here that they have to do to keep their head above water on the defensive end. And it's that side of the ball that scares me more with Alec Burks. And I'm just going to say, I was an advocate for Alec Burks to see time before the series started. And the more I see how this series is playing out, I'm not sure the Knicks can trust him on defense. So what I would do, obviously I'm not Tom Thibodeau, he knows a lot more than me, but I would probably go with Jericho Sims as an 8th man to get, something 5, 8, 10, 12 minutes tonight, maybe, during the minutes that Hartenstein sits, and you're going to slide Precious then over to the 4 in that scenario. And the last thing I'll say about Sims, look, he's a third big off the bench. He's not a perfect player, but he got a lot of time this year in some big spots, and I think he showed the ability to stay on the floor in some big time moments. And he's also very switchable, which is the other thing that you like. Again, it always comes back to this concept of switching. The Knicks have to be comfortable switching. He's a very good switch big, so I think you give Sims a little time and see how he does.
All right, be interesting to see where they go there. Sims, as you just mentioned, likely can bring a little bit more on defense than Burks, and I think if Tom Thibodeau doesn't see what he would like to see from Alec Burks on defense, could get the quick hook if he does get some playing time. Okay, last thing here, J-Mac, when you look at Game 3, let's do this. Let's assume Jalen Brunson plays and the Knicks have their all-star point guard on the floor. With that being said, what are the keys to the Knicks getting a win on Friday night and taking a commanding 3-0 lead in this series?
Well, if Brunson plays and he's out there for the majority of the minutes with Dante DiVincenzo and Josh Hart, and I think most especially Isaiah Hartenstein, who was fantastic in Game 2, I think, again, to sound like a broken record here, I think the Knicks are going to be able to score. And I think they're going to be able to score regardless of who the fifth guy is on the court. They're going to have to work a little bit harder for it, but what else is new in Knicks land? Defensively, they have to be attentive, I think is the first word that I would use. I thought in the second quarter when the Pacers were really on the verge of blowing that game open in their favor, you saw the Knicks on a lot of possessions just kind of fail to make very obvious switches. And then more than that, and this is something that I think is unavoidable, it seemed like they were kind of running out of gas in that second quarter there. Now, Jalen Brunson came back after halftime. I think he gave the entire team a jolt of energy. I think they played with a lot more urgency. We saw a couple of missed closeouts there in the second quarter of Game 2. We didn't see any more of those after Brunson came back. So you can't let up against this Pacer team, and you can't let up in the half court, especially, but you really can't let up in transition either. So really it's just about how much do you have left in the tank. You got to get back in transition. You got to get on your assignments. And last thing I'll say, unless you're sure that you're drawing the foul, and this is a tough thing to be able to talk about, you can't fall down. If you're driving, we've seen this a couple times with Hartenstein. We've seen it a couple times with some other guys. If you fall down, even for a second, and you give the Pacers a 5-on-4 opportunity, not only are they going to score in all likelihood, they're probably going to get a great look from three because that is what they do. So you got to make sure all five guys are back in transition to try to limit those sorts of opportunities for Indiana.
All right, we'll see if the Knicks are able to do that. Game 3 in Naptown on Friday night. Knicks looking to take a 3-0 series lead. Jonathan Macri, the dean of Knicks Film School, he's going to be all over it. And if you have any complaints to file, you send those to Andrew Claudio with KFS. You go and do that. J-Mac, I appreciate the time. I know it's been a busy playoffs for both of us. We will talk soon, man.
Appreciate you, Dex. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Anytime, man.